The final section of the grade 11 math syllabus is the section of statistics, and it is a great opportunity to cash in on marks. So I always encourage my students, make sure that you are very good at answering these questions, because they are never that complicated and such great real life applications that they actually are quite enjoyable to dive into these things. So let's check before we dive into statistics that we are familiar with some of the important terminology. So the first word that should be very familiar to you at this stage is the mean, and that is basically the average of all the data scores. Okay, then we have the median, and that is the score in the middle. Okay, or the middlemost data value. And then the mode is the score that occurs the most often. Right, then we learned about quartiles, and quartiles divide the data into 4 equal parts. Now, it's very important that you know how to find the position of the quartiles. So quartile 1, sometimes called the lower quartile, you can work out the position 1/4 of the number of data scores plus 1. Okay, quartile 2, which is the same as the median, is equal to 2/4 or 1/2 times n plus 1. That's the location of quartile 2. And quartile 3, sometimes called the upper quartile, 3/4 times n plus 1. So in each instance, these formulae will tell you the position of that quartile, and then you'll go and you'll see, which data score is number 12, for example. That is quartile 1, the score in that 12th position. Okay, then we've got range. Now, range is basically our maximum value minus the minimum value, how spread out the data is, okay? But because of pesky little things, like we're going to be looking at just now, outliers, sometimes we're better off using the interquartile range instead of the range. And interquartile range is simply where we take quartile 3 and we subtract quartile 1. All right, so you just wait and see what is asked of you in the question, and that determines which one you use. Okay, and then outliers. An outlier is basically a data score that is very different from the rest, and that data score will affect the mean. And so when we are calculating things, we don't want to calculate with outliers, but we also can't just be reckless and say, well, this is an outlier because I think so. We need to be mathematical in our approach. And so what we do is we say an outlier is anything smaller than, and then we'll work out quartile 1 minus 1.5 times the interquartile range. That's this thing here. Okay? Or anything bigger than, and I bet you could guess this, quartile 3 plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. So we can never just, especially not at grade 11 level, we can never just say, that one looks different, therefore it's an outlier. We have to substantiate our answers with calculations, and these are the calculations we need to show. Now, in grade 11, we are introduced to 2 new and very important terms. The one is the variance, and the other one, the standard deviation. So variance measures the variability from the mean, and if you wanted a little symbol for it, it's this small letter sigma squared is going to be variance. Okay, more importantly, or maybe it's not more important, but it is more commonly asked, is the standard deviation, and this measures how spread out your data is. So basically, if you have a large standard deviation, then the data is very spread out. If you have a small standard deviation, then the data is clustered together. Okay, so standard deviation is very important, and the symbol for that is just sigma. Now, when your teacher first introduces these concepts to you, they will probably talk you through some very long ways to work out the variance, and then from there to take the square root of this to get the standard deviation. But the good news is that we can rely on our calculators to do this work for us. So if you have a scientific calculator like this one, you will be able to here in the mode section choose a statistics mode, and then from that, and we're going to look at that in our next example, but from that space you'll then be able to work out the standard deviation. And you'll see these questions, if we work them out manually, they take many steps, a whole table, all kinds of complicated things. But when they get asked to us, most of the time in our exam papers, they are 2-mark questions. And that's simply because we need to know how to use our calculators to determine the standard deviation. And then if they want the variance, we'll take the answer we got here and we'll simply square it to give us variance. Let's have a look at an example. The birth weight in kilograms of 10 newborns is recorded below. 3,5, 4,7, etc. Okay. The first question they say is calculate the mean and standard deviation of this data set, and then how many learners scored within one standard deviation of the mean. Now, when it comes to these questions, please be careful, okay? The first thing that I do, and it's a good habit to be in, is I check, are these data scores in order from smallest to biggest, okay? And in this instance, they aren't. Here's a 3, 4, 3, okay? Then I'll check, do they need to be in order? Okay, they need to be in order for things that are measures of position. So things like range, quartiles, interquartile range, that kind of thing. So fortunately, we've just been asked for the mean and the standard deviation. And then this second question is also standard deviation related. So we don't need to worry about the order. We can jump straight in. This question is probably going to be 2 marks for the mean and 2 marks for the standard deviation. Nice and simple. So question 1. X bar, that's the symbol for mean. How do we do it? Well, we need to get our calculators ready. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say mode, 2 for stats, and then 1 for variance. That's going to get us to the right place. So mode, 2, 1. Now we can start to input this data. The calculator will give us a table that we're going to populate. Let's make sure we can see all of these scores. So there with your calculator, why don't you give it a try? Type in all of these data scores. After you've put each one in, you hit the equals button. Once you've got all 10 scores in, you then are going to be very careful here. You're just going to use this AC button. So don't switch off your calculator or anything drastic like that. We're just going to press AC, okay, after we've input all our data. And then we're going to hit some new buttons. We're going to hit the shift. And then from there, number 1, because you'll see there's stat written above that. So shift 1 for stat. And then again, 4 for variance. And now we've got options. Okay, what we are trying to work out there is X bar, the mean. And so that means we're going to choose option 2. And so now I'm going to press 2. And then equals, and my calculator has worked out that the mean of this data is 3,69 kilograms. All right. Then I also needed the standard deviation. So let's have a look. That's going to be standard deviation is the little sigma sign. Okay. So I'm going to, again, because my data is already there, I'm not going to now retype everything in. I'm again just going to put that AC button. So AC, and then we're going to say shift 1. This is the similar process that we're going to follow. But now, shift 1, we don't want, we want to choose 4 again. But then we don't want to choose the X bar. We want to then choose number 3, which has got the little sigma sign there. So let's actually say we're going to choose 3 there. And in this one, we chose 2. Just so that later on when you look at it, you know what's what. Okay, so let's do that. We're going to choose option 3 equals, and there we have it, our standard deviation, also 0,69 kilograms. Okay, the units are the same. Now question 2 says, how many babies measure within one standard deviation of the mean? Okay, so what we need is our mean. And we need to say, okay, what is one standard deviation less than the mean? And what is one standard deviation more than the mean? So that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're just going to work that out. So x bar plus 1 standard deviation. Okay, let's work that out. 3,69 plus 0,69 gives us 4,38. And then in the other direction, minus 1 standard deviation. So 3,69 minus 0,69, and that gives us 3. Okay, so those are my parameters. Anything bigger than this is outside of 1 standard deviation. Anything smaller than this is outside of 1 standard deviation. So basically, I'm looking for values because they ask how many measure within. So I'm looking for values between 3 and 4,38. So let's go down our data set and see which ones satisfy. That one is good. 4,7 is too big. 3,9 is good. 4,2 just fits. 2,4 is too small. 3,7 is good. 3,2 is good. 2,8 too small. 4,4 just too big. 4,1 is in. Okay, so how many babies measure within? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 babies within 1 standard deviation of the mean. You may also be asked to calculate the mean and standard deviation of grouped data. So what is it that makes this data grouped? Well, that's here in the class interval section. So there are 22 learners, or whatever the case may be, let's call them learners, who scored between 0 and 50. 34 who scored between 50 and 100, etc. Okay, so now if I want to type this into my calculator, I'm going to need to do a little bit of work before I'm ready to do that. Okay, the first thing I need to do is I need to get my frequency on. Okay, so you're going to hit the shift button on your calculator, and then you're going to hit the mode / actually what we want now is setup. Okay, then from there you are actually going to need to go down because we need a whole other menu there, and then we're going to choose number 3 for stats, and it'll say there frequency ? Do we want 1 on or 2 off? And we want it on. Okay, so that's our first thing that we do, is we activate the frequency on our calculator. Then what we would need to do, if you're getting ready just like we did earlier, so you'd go mode, 2 for stat, 1 for variance, and then it brings up the table. You'll see there's now a frequency column because you've done the right setup. Okay, but I need an X value to fill in this table, and at the moment I can't fill in 0 to 50, 50 to 100, etc. So I need to do what we did in grade 10, which was to work out a midpoint. Okay, and remember we used to call that X, so this actually makes sense now. How did I get a midpoint? I said, right, 0 plus 50, and then divide by 2. So 0 plus 50 is 50. 50 divided by 2 is 25. 100 plus 50 is 150 divided by 2, 75. And so what you'll be doing each time is we adding the class boundaries and dividing by 2. Okay, so that gives me 125, and this gives me 175. So now I've got midpoints, which are going to go in my first column, and frequencies, which are going to go in my second column. So I'm going to type it into my calculator like that. And now I'm ready to answer the questions. Okay, 1, what is the standard what is the mean? Sorry, that was the first question. So X bar is equal to, I'm going to press AC, shift 1 to bring up my stats menu, 4 for variance, and we want mean X bar. That's option number 2. So there, 96,36, that's going to be the mean. And then secondly, they want the standard deviation. So again, AC, just to clear that last calculation, shift 1 for the statistics menu, 4 for variance, and then 3 brings us that sigma option. And there we have it, 51,01 is our standard deviation. Now that looks like quite a big standard deviation, which means this data is very spread out around the mean. Okay, so there we have it. We can be asked to calculate the mean and the standard deviation, even if the data is grouped. And then just remember, check that the frequency is switched on. In actual fact, I generally leave the frequency on my calculator. And if it's an example like the previous one we did, all the frequencies were just 1, and so that's okay. And then when I come to a question like this, it's already ready for me, and I can type in the different frequencies when I need to. Okay, but it's important to remember we have to calculate the midpoint so that we have an x value to add to our calculator.